And we switch over now to Ivo for giving a presentation from Zimmer Biomet on how to manage software requirements. Welcome, Ivo.
Thanks for the introduction, Leon. I'll keep my own introduction even shorter because I had 8 minutes, but I'll try to keep it a little bit briefer. I'm Ivo Flipse. I'm a project manager at Zimmer Biomet, and I've been with Zimmer Biomet since 2014 and in medical devices since 2008. My team works on preoperative hip planning software, and through trial and error, we've gained a lot of experience in how to avoid pitfalls of developing software as a medical device. And this has resulted in 2 successful 510K submissions and several audits without major findings, and 3 this year so far. So far so good. I'm gonna switch off my my camera now. So great mind thinks alike, because I second a lot of things in my talk that Johannes also mentioned. And I'd like to comment on what Jouke said earlier regarding audits. I believe that you should always work in a compliant manner so that you're always producing audit-ready documents. Now, I'm going to try to convince you of the benefits of managing your requirements using software tools and give you some examples. So say you want to implement 2 new features like adding new languages or adding an about page. This can probably be implemented in a week or so and even be tested, whereas this one might take you 6 to 8 weeks. Now, if you're on a 2 to 3 week release cycle, like Aidens is, I believe, then adding these languages is going to mess up your release cycle, and it's going to create a massive bottleneck. And if you then want to do a bug fix release in the 4th week, then suddenly you have a lot of trouble because you can't release, or you have to roll back all your changes to remove the translation work to release the bug fix. So instead, by leveraging software version control for your requirements and specifications, you can implement the changes in parallel in separate branches. So for example, the about page gets released here, the translations get released here, though in reality, probably somewhere off screen because it takes forever. By using software to manage your requirements, you can also write code to check for things like finding gaps in your trace matrix. And bonus points if you make these checks fail your CI. For example, when somebody adds a software requirement without an accompanying test. And as you can see here, we have 2 gaps. So the software requirement doesn't trace to its source, and it also doesn't have a test associated with it. So I would go into the requirements text file, add a trace to the accompanying use requirements. I do the same for the test. So I add a new test, trace it back to the software requirements. I regenerate the trace matrix, and voila, the gaps have been filled. And also note that this type of process would prevent you from accidentally filling in the wrong cell in the table or having typos in your identifiers. Though granted, you can still make typos in your text editor. Typically, when you review documents, you go vertically like this. So you review all the software requirements, and you might miss that somebody added or edited a requirement, but added a test. But that test doesn't actually test the requirement properly because you're focusing on the requirements at this moment. Instead, with this workflow, you focus on a change more in an end-to-end fashion. So for example, if you change something in the software requirements, you make sure that the tests make sense and that they pass. You review the code changes and any other documentation changes that might result from this, like changing your DDP or your IFU. And who doesn't know the problem of emailing around multiple revisions until you get to the final version, only to discover a last-minute GDP error, like an outdated document revision number, and you have to create yet another revision. This is actually a true story that happened to me. And so by storing everything in version control, everyone has access to the latest revisions in a centralized location instead of somebody routed a document for approval, but he sent the second last revision, and now everything has to be redone again. By using pull requests or other code review tools, you can focus on the changes that have been made, or just on the changes, so you don't have to read the whole document. You just look at the parts that have been impacted by the change, and you can see all the changes in one go without having to read the entire document. So my hack is typically to look at the revision history and then find what changed and only look at those parts, and then hope that people keep the revision history in check. And by implementing your changes in separate branches, typically the changes are much more focused on just adding the about page or just adding, tweaking this one thing. So they are much smaller and much easier to review, and they don't necessarily need everyone on the team to review them because, well, for a bug fix, you might not need regulatory, for example. By integrating with the software developer's workflow, you can also make sure that the whole development team can participate. So as you can see here, we are a small team, but everyone participated in writing our documentation. And this makes it much more likely that the documents are actually correct because they are written by the same people who wrote the code. And it's not just some window dressing checkbox activity or a Herculean task that QA performs on the side, but still, like, everything is wrong because the QA person may not necessarily be able to read the code and check whether it's correct or not. And in case you want to get started, just like us, check out Doorstop on GitHub. You can leverage Doorstop as an off-the-shelf tool for getting started with managing your requirements and specifications using software version control. Thanks for your attention. And if you have any questions, you can always ask them later on.
Cool. All right. Thanks, Ivo, for that really interesting presentation. I think it's always cool when companies or teams try to use like more sophisticated tools for requirements management. And I think that's definitely an example of one of those cases.